Hello friends. Hold on tight. Russia has begun to hit the wallet. A Moscow court has just taken 30 billion rubles from a Latvian bank, just like that, with a single ruling. And now, in Estonia, the foreign minister is begging Kyiv not to touch Russian tankers. Can you imagine? A country that for 3 years shouted about defeating Russia is now asking not to provoke Moscow. Today we will break down how the Baltic states are paying for their policies, and why this is only the beginning. Watch until the end. This is important. Latvia lost 30 billion. What happened? On December 2nd, the Moscow Arbitration Court issued a ruling fully satisfying the claim of the Deputy Prosecutor General of Russia. The defendants were the Latvian RDB Bank and companies affiliated with it. Think about these numbers. 30 billion rubles worth of Russian assets belonging to Latvian residents were transferred to the Russian state. These include real estate in central Moscow, land plots totaling more than 1.24 hectares, commercial buildings and premises, with a total area of over 30,000 square meters. Do you know what's most interesting? The Prosecutor General's office thoroughly uncovered the scheme the Latvians used to withdraw money. The bank, through a subsidiary, controlled a Moscow-based company. This company was the nominal owner of the real estate, and to ensure control, 100% of the shares were pledged to the bank. Here is how the scheme worked. A loan agreement was concluded. The repayment deadline was extended to 2030. Payments were structured so that the principal debt did not decrease, but instead increased. Prosecutors directly stated, such a scheme has no economic sense. It was used exclusively to move capital abroad. From 2022 to 2024, bypassing sanctions, 806,000 euros and 30 million rubles were withdrawn. Total capital outflow exceeded 105 million. Why did this happen? We'll get to that in a moment. First, let's look at what's happening in Estonia. Estonia is scared and asks not to touch tankers. Here's a dramatic turn. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna made a striking statement. He urged Kyiv to abandon attacks on Russian tankers in the Baltic Sea. Do you understand how absurd this is? For 3 years, Estonia loudly demanded victory, sent all its weapons, severed economic ties, closed borders, and now, in panic, asks not to anger Moscow. Tsahkna said directly, transferring sabotage operations to this region is an unreasonable step. It could worsen the situation in the Baltic states. Why are the Estonians so frightened? They already had an incident. They tried to board a Russian tanker from the so-called Shadow Fleet. Do you know how it ended? Russia scrambled a fighter jet, disgracefully drove away the Estonian patrol boat and demonstrated it is ready to defend its interests. After that, Estonian military forces received strict orders not to approach Russian vessels, because next time it might not end with mere embarrassment. And here comes the most important part. The Estonians realize that if Russian ships and aircraft begin actively patrolling the Baltic Sea, their economy will collapse. The ports of Tallinn and Pärnu could turn into dead zones. Why did Russia strike Latvia? Now let's return to Latvia. Here is what the Baltic states did, and what they are now paying for. In August 2022, Latvia's parliament declared Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. The Russian Prosecutor General's office called this decision an act of extrajudicial punishment. Then it escalated. Latvia suspended all intergovernmental agreements with Russia in economics, science, and culture, cancelled simplified travel for border residents, cancelled social protection agreements for Russian military pensioners living in Latvia. But the main thing, they seized Russian property, including the Moscow House Complex in Riga, a 4,482 square meter building, and its land. All of this was sold and the proceeds were directed to financing Russia's enemy. RDB Bank also distinguished itself. In February 2022, it blocked over $81,000 citing sanctions compliance. The funds belong to the Moscow Center for International Cooperation, and now Moscow has responded, a debt deserves repayment. Panic behind closed doors. Imagine what is happening right now inside government. Buildings in Riga, Tallinn and Vilnius. There is real panic. The Moscow court's decision is not just about recovering 30 billion rubles. It creates a precedent. Pandora's box has been opened for all Baltic businessmen and banks with assets in Russia. Now every Latvian, Estonian or Lithuanian entrepreneur who invested in Russian real estate or business is sitting and wondering, will I be next? Moscow has made it clear. The one-way game is over. For every seizure of Russian property, there will be a mirror response. With interest, emergency meetings have already begun in Latvia regarding the financial sector. RDB Bank was one of the country's largest banks. Its assets in Russia were estimated at hundreds of millions of euros. Now all that money, all real estate and all income-generating assets in Moscow and the Moscow region have gone into the Russian treasury. And this was not the only bank, not the only company. Now all other Latvian businessmen with Russian assets are frantically trying to figure out how to save their investments. But the train has already left. The Russian prosecutor's office is systematically uncovering all schemes, shell companies and capital withdrawal attempts. Each such scheme is now treated as an unfriendly action. Lithuania is next. Lithuanians know they are next. They also have businessmen with assets in Russia. They also confiscated Russian property. Now they wait in fear for Moscow courts to begin reviewing their cases. The Lithuanian government has quietly begun searching for negotiation channels with Moscow, trying to reduce tensions. So far unsuccessfully. Russia has made it clear, the time for talks was earlier. Now it is time to pay the bills. Lithuanian politicians privately admit they were drawn into an adventure whose consequences were not calculated, especially the blockade of the Kaliningrad region. Kaliningrad transit was a major source of income for Lithuanian railways. Now railway workers are unemployed and the budget must pay benefits. Turkey also reacted. Turkey sharply responded to attacks on civilian tankers in the Black Sea. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called such actions unacceptable. Ankara sent an official protest through intelligence channels. Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened a radical response to attacks on vessels connected to Russia. The Baltic states took this warning very seriously. They do not want to be the ones left responsible. The illusion collapsed. For years, the Baltic states believed the alliance would protect them from any consequences. They thought they could seize Russian property, suppress the rights of Russian-speaking populations, and destroy historical monuments, and Moscow would simply swallow it. It turned out Russia has a full arsenal of economic and legal tools. They were not used before. Now they are Baltic. Governments are shocked to realize how vulnerable their economies really are. Transit is lost. Ports re-empty. For years, Baltic ports earned well from Russian cargo. Now transit has been redirected elsewhere. Port workers are unemployed. Budgets are losing billions of euros in tax revenues. A trap with no exit. They cannot publicly admit mistakes and normalize relations with Russia. That would be political suicide and loss of Western support. But continued confrontation leads to further economic decline, new lawsuits in Russian courts, and new business losses. They see no way out. That's why these awkward attempts have begun. Estonia asks Kyiv not to touch tankers. Lithuania quietly seeks unofficial contacts. Latvian businessmen probe possibilities through intermediaries. But Moscow shows no interest in dialogue with those who spent years spitting in its direction. Society is waking up. Public dissatisfaction is growing. The Baltic states long portrayed themselves as victims of Russian aggression. This image brought money and Western support. Now it turns out this performance cost them real economic losses, billions of euros, and no one is compensating them. The alliance provides symbolic military support and bases, but it will not pay Russian bills. Ordinary people are asking, why ruin relations with the largest neighbor? Why give up cheap Russian gas and oil? Why shut down transit and lose jobs? Authorities have no answers, because their policies were based on emotion and Russophobia, not economic logic. Russia shows the price of Russophobia. Russia is methodically demonstrating the price of these policies, step by step, and that price turned out to be far higher than expected. Most importantly, this is only the beginning. The Russian Prosecutor General's office has already stated it continues to identify other cases of unlawful seizure of Russian property. New lawsuits are coming, so the Baltic states will still learn what real accountability looks like. That's all for today. The key point: Russia has moved from words to actions. 30 billion rubles is a serious amount, and a precedent that has frightened all Baltic businessmen with assets in Russia. The coming weeks will show how far this goes. Subscribe to follow developments. Take care. See you in the next episode.